Adam, pop quiz. What's something Toronto keeps trying to cover up?
That could be anything, but offhand, I'll say it's the fact that the Leafs' quote unquote window has probably closed.
Okay, that's a good guess, but I'm thinking more literally, like physically cover up. Take a guess.
That's something we paved over, like an old stadium or maybe an entire neighborhood.
Okay, those are some good instincts, but let's go even deeper. Underground. Toronto has this long habit of covering up the natural world, especially when it gets in the way. Forests, wetlands, creeks, the messier parts of the landscape that didn't fit the plan. Garrison Creek was one of the biggest. It carved valleys through what's now the West End, helped shape entire neighborhoods, and then it got inconvenient. So the city does what it often does. It buried it, stuffed the creek into a sewer, filled in the ravine, and built over it like nothing had ever been there. But here's the thing. When you try to bury something that's still alive, especially something that moves, it has a habit of coming back. Not out of spite, just out of persistence, like a ghost that was never really gone to begin with.
And like every good ghost story, it doesn't stay buried forever because eventually two podcasters come around to dredge it up.
Exactly. So today we're talking about a lost river, a ghost river, some may say. One the city tried to erase, but it's still here, still moving, still shaping Toronto in quiet, persistent ways.
So this is the story of Garrison Creek.
And this is Muddy York. Imagine you get into a time machine. You punch in the coordinates St. Clair West and Dufferin. But the year? Let's say a few thousand years ago. No streetcars, no sidewalks, no city grid. You step out and the land is uneven, sloping, wild. The ground rises and falls like a slow wave. Two little streams are just beginning to form. One bubbles up near Vaughan Road at Witchwood and Valewood. They call it the Humewood Reach. The other starts near Earl's Court in Morrison. That's the Springmount Stream. Eventually, these two streams meet just north of what's now Davenport Road. They join forces and become Garrison Creek. It winds south, carving a valley through the land that will one day be Christie Pitts, Bickford Park, and Trinity Bellwoods. That path, that shallow canyon of water, starts shaping everything around it. This all began about 12,000 years ago, right after the last ice age. Back then, the area we now call Toronto was buried under a massive glacier, part of what's known as the Wisconsin Ice Sheet. When that glacier started melting, it released a huge amount of water. That runoff carved out the first paths in the soil. The meltwater followed natural slopes in the land, cutting channels through sand, clay, and gravel. As time passed, snowmelt and rainfall continued to flow through those channels, deepening the valleys and shaping what would become Toronto's early topography. Garrison Creek formed this process. It wasn't just a stream, it was a memory of ice carved into the ground. By the early 1800s, that memory had turned into geography. The valley was part of the growing city. Garrison Creek flowed south and emptied into Lake Ontario just east of Fort York, the military garrison that gave the creek its name. At the time, the water was clear and cold, especially in the spring when runoff was strongest. The creek's flow was steady and dependable, especially in the spring when meltwater swelled its banks. At its mouth near Fort York, small boats could moor with ease. Upriver, the land was a patchwork of farmland, wooden lots, and early estates, still open, still unclaimed by city sprawl. One of the most prominent landowners near the headwaters was the Bull family, whose property was so closely tied to the stream that locals began referring to that upper stretch as Bull's Creek.
At the time, the creek was considered an asset. People didn't see it as something to avoid. They built homes and farms close to it, drawn by the natural slope of the land, which helped with drainage. Trees lined its banks, creating shaded paths. Wildlife came to drink. The sound of water moving through the ravine was a familiar part of the landscape. It was a place where you might fish or simply follow the stream on foot. The creek was woven into everyday life. Living in the area meant living with the creek, not apart from it. This was a city in progress. The forest had been cleared in places, and early homes were beginning to cluster near creeks and crossroads. but it hadn't yet hardened into the grid of blocks and infrastructure that we know today. Instead, the land was still asserting itself. Roads followed natural contours rather than survey lines. People built where the ground allowed it. Farm plots edged into wooded ravines, footpaths curved with the slope of the hills. Garrison Creek moved through the early city like a quiet backbone. It provided water, but also did much more than that. The creek influenced how people lived with the land. It cooled the air in summer, soaked the surrounding soil in the spring, and naturally shaped how settlements took form. The flow of water divided space into usable plots and soft boundaries. Before Toronto had official neighborhoods, the land was already being guided by the logic of the creek. The areas we now call Humewood and Earls Court were a patchwork of fields, orchards, and woodlots. People followed footpaths that hugged the edges of the ravine. Wagons found the firmest ground along the higher ridges, and where the land sloped gently toward the water, homesteads appeared. It made sense. Water drained well there, the soil was good, and the creek was close by for chores and cooling off in the summer. As those paths were used more, they hardened into habits. Habits became routes. Routes became roads, and even today, you can still read those decisions in the map. Vaughan Road curves the way it does because it once followed the land beside the creek. Niagara Street bends because that was the easiest way around a hill shaped by the stream. What we think of now as quirks of the city's layout were really just people adjusting to a landscape that already had its own ideas.
But then the land started changing. The open valley that once made room for farms and footpaths began to fill in. New houses rose along the ridgelines, trees came down, and roads pushed deeper into the terrain. What had once been edges of woodland became the sites of slaughterhouses and markets. And the creek, which had once offered fresh water and a cooling breeze, was now being used as a drain for waste. Its clarity vanished. The current turned murky. By the 1870s, the city of Toronto, then just a few decades old, began reshaping the landscape with more intention. Garrison Creek was rerouted into underground sewer systems. The ravines were filled in, and bridges like Harbour and Crawford were built to span the gaps, then buried beneath the soil and parkland. Those structures still exist, but now they lie under roads, lawns, and playgrounds. The creek didn't vanish. It was layered over and redirected piece by piece until the surface forgot the shape of what had come before. What had once been a feature became a liability, something to engineer around, something to contain.
After a heavy storm, the signs show up quickly. Sidewalks turn into streams, basements fill with water that smells faintly of the past, intersections flood, and sewers overflow. It feels less like weather and more like the city remembering something that it had tried to forget. And it's happening more often. Climate change means more intense sudden rainfall, the kind of storms that test every pipe in the city. Much of Toronto's sewer system is over 100 years old. Narrow, hand-laid brick tunnels built in the beds of old creeks like Garrison. They weren't designed for this kind of volume. When they fail, water doesn't politely wait for its turn, it rises fast. It floods parks and garages, it hisses up through manholes and back into toilets, it reclaims the path it used to follow. And these aren't random events. They're part of a pattern that has repeated for over a century. From Trinity Bellwoods to Bigford Park and through the West End's oddly bent streets, the land still carries the shape of Garrison Creek. The city keeps trying to respond, installing larger underground tanks, laying new culverts, and spending millions on upgraded drainage systems. But these efforts often feel like patchwork solutions, trying to hold back something deeper and older. Even the systems built to manage the creek are beginning to fall short. Toronto's weather has changed. Rain doesn't fall steadily anymore. It arrives in sudden, intense bursts. Climate change has made storms more severe and less predictable. When that much water hits the ground all at once, it rushes to the lowest point.
And this is when Garrison Creek reemerges, not as a picturesque stream, but as a weak point in the city's infrastructure. Many of the storm sewers in the West End were laid right along the old creek bed. Some are over 100 years old. They were never designed for the kind of storms we see now. When they reach capacity, they overflow. And when they do, it's not just inconvenient, it's a reminder. What pours out of those pipes isn't just stormwater. It's the imprint of a waterway the city tried to forget. The creek was redirected, but never truly replaced. The land still remembers where the water once flowed, and when rainfall pushes the system past its limit, the water flows those familiar contours, slopes, soil, and gravity.
So when the manholes hiss and your basement turns into a wading pool, it's not just infrastructure failing, it's the land remembering. The water never signed off on the new blueprints. It still thinks it lives here. The good news? We're starting to listen, slowly in the Toronto way. No big unveilings, no splashy campaigns, just the occasional rain garden beside a schoolyard, a plaque in Christie Pitts, a faint line on the sidewalk marking where creek once ran. These don't bring the river back, but they admit it was here, and sometimes that's the first step. Not fixing the past, but learning to live with it.
Exactly. Not every ghost story ends in dread. What Adam is talking about is that in the late 1990s and early 2000s, people started tracing the path of Garrison Creek again. Local historians, urban ecologists, and residents who were simply curious about why their backyard kept flooding or why certain streets always stayed wet. They followed the route through the back alleys, across parks, and down strange little dips in the land. What they found wasn't a myth, it was a map, one the city had quietly built over. The community groups, particularly the Garrison Creek Community Group and the Headwaters Community, played a crucial role in getting the creek recognized by doing extensive groundwork. They researched historical maps, current city topography, and organized public walking tours that traced the path of the buried creek. These efforts helped make the hidden river visible again to the public imagination. In response, the City of Toronto began incorporating those insights into public space design. One notable outcome was the Garrison Creek Discovery Walk, a marked trail that follows the route of the creek. The city also supported small-scale landscape interventions like rain gardens and educational plaques that align with the buried creek's original path. This growing awareness has quietly begun to influence how Toronto designs its urban landscape. As knowledge of Garrison Creek's old path resurfaced, thanks to the community efforts we talked about, planners began to rethink how they manage water. Instead of trying to fight natural drainage patterns, new infrastructure began to work with them. Green infrastructure projects were introduced in key areas. These include bioswales that slow and filter runoff, permeable pavement that allows water to soak through, and stormwater retention ponds designed to hold excess rainfall. Some parks, particularly those sitting atop the old creek bed, were subtly reshaped to temporarily store floodwater. These changes may seem modest, but together they represent a shift, an attempt to listen to the land rather than overwrite it. And maybe that's what this has all been about. Not recovering something we lost, but finally hearing what's been underfoot the whole time.
So next time you're walking along Harbour or lying in a sunken patch of grass at Trinity Bellwoods, just remember, you're on the body of a river, one that carved valleys long before there were sidewalks or zoning maps. It shaped the city, was buried beneath it, and still bubbles up when we least expect it. And if your basement floods, pour one out for Garrison Creek. Maybe it's not your downspout, maybe it's the ghost of a watershed with unfinished business. Or maybe it's a city learning, slowly and awkwardly, how to live with the past instead of paving over it.
We said it at the beginning, Toronto has a habit of covering things up. Forests, rivers, and entire neighborhoods. If it gets in the way, we build it over. We keep going. But what does a city lose when it forgets its own shape? What else have we paved over without looking back? We like to think the past stays buried, that memory is something you can file away in zoning bylaws or pour concrete over. So, guys, that was the final thought, and that's our show. Big thanks to the Lost Rivers Project and to everyone working to reconnect Toronto with the stories it tried to bury.
If you'd like to reach us about this episode or any other, you can email us at muddy_york@outlook.com. You can follow us on Twitter at Toronto_history, on Blue Sky at Muddy York, all one word, or on Facebook at Muddy York History. And there will be a quiz on all of those names later, so please keep them in mind.
All right, guys, and feel free to reach out. Send us an email. We love hearing from you. We want to hear more stories, ideas, and and tell us if you call in, or sorry, email us. Tell us your favorite Toronto ghost story, literal or civic. Maybe you've got a story about haunted buildings, haunted bylaws, haunted condos. Just reach out. We accept all genres.